The words in the glass had definitely startled him, and when he snapped back to look again, there was nothing inside. A chill ran through him, and he couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched. He wondered if it was the bartender, maybe a business person, or perhaps an awakened one. Either way, the idea of him getting stalked by an NPC really amuses him. Just then, Donnan called out to him, wondering why he was zoning out. Brushing it off, Roland tells her that everything is fine. As he was walking towards them, he asked why would someone with such abilities choose to communicate this way instead of facing him directly. He noted that when a jump scare like this occurs without warning, it could easily scare someone to death, literally. Suddenly, he remembered Rose Cafe, room 302. He asserted that the one leaving notes in the book was the same one behind this message. And that mention of the day divine will descend, could it be referring to the real-world event of the Red Moon's arrival? Maybe that's when they will finally meet in person. But then, how could anyone here, in this dream world, know what was happening in his own world? The more he thought, the more his head throbbed. After all, as long as he's not inside the dream world, the entire place will freeze in time. What frustrated him most was that even if his theory was correct, the location still remained a mystery. Because who on earth knew where this Rose Cafe was? Then he realized the name wasn't an issue after all. What if he just opened a cafe himself and called it Rose Cafe, even set up a room 302? Then it would certainly satisfy the requirement. With this sudden clarity, he set the glass down and left with the three young witches. Later, Fei Yuhan picked up our boy's glass, looking all curious. She couldn't imagine what could have rattled a hunter like him. To her, it looked like an ordinary drink. Noticing faint cracks along the stem, which was a sign of lost control and power, she inspected it further, first sniffing, then carefully sipping, and concluded it was just regular alcohol. Oof, this girl is a bit crazy. Anyways, afterwards, she firmly asserted that something had definitely happened earlier, making her all the more intrigued. The scene shifted back to Neverwinter, where several fully armed god punishment witches lowered their heads to Roland, remarking their thanks for his hospitality and declaring that last night had been the most wonderful experience of the last 400 years. They even said they would look forward to crossing paths with the dream world again after the final battle. Anna, curious about what had happened, gazed up at Roland, and he casually explained that he had taken them to a lavish, high-end banquet. The mere mention left Anna pouting, wondering when she might get to taste such treats. Seeing her expectant eyes, Roland couldn't help but ruffle her hair, remarking that in a few years, she surely could. Soon after, Roland made his way to the office, where Nightingale handed him a package she'd picked up downstairs from Sean. Inside, Roland found a pile of stone fragments and a letter. As he skimmed through and revealed that the so-called ancient ruins were far from just an undersea, and he was surprised they stretched across the entire landscape. The garrison at Daching Port had uncovered 16 sites linked to the Stickman relics, and when mapped together, they spanned an area large enough to fit 7 or 8 ports altogether. Beneath the desert lay stone walls 5 to 10 meters thick. They even noticed tufts of green grass poking through. Roland reflected that if so many stones were found just near Daching, then how many more must lie hidden under the endless cape? If these were really the remains of silicon-based life, then their sheer number pointed to a slaughter of unimaginable scale. He speculated the southern desert hadn't always been barren. Perhaps Silver Lake wasn't born as a hidden underground river after all. He believes the place had once been lush, no different from the rest of the continent, that is, until the Divine War. The Stickman peoples had likely fallen in staggering numbers, with their bodies covering the land. Meanwhile, murals in the Cursed Temple confirmed that the Radiation people had taken the Divine Relic and secured victory. But unlike carbon-based life, silicon-based corpses didn't decompose into soil, meaning they don't return to the cycle of life, resulting in layer upon layer of their corpses piled atop the grasslands, thick as a building, damming rivers, crushing forests, erasing habitats, and thus only vines could snake through the cracks to absorb sunlight. Over time, the upper layers crumbled into desert sands. He concluded that Iron Sand City and Daching Port were actually built on corpses, and the conclusion was enough to send a chill down Roland's spine. He remarked to himself that if the Divine War truly had no end, then how many sacrifices would this world have to bear? Snapping back, he was jolted by Nightingale's voice. She looked worried, saying he'd been zoning out at the blueprints, his face so pale like he had just received some terrible news. Roland shared his thoughts but quickly brushed them off, explaining maybe he was overthinking. If the world was truly that doomed, it was almost too bleak to accept. Nightingale, after a moment's pause, asserted that even if all his guesses were right, it didn't mean there were no solutions. Surprised, Roland looked to her, curious what she had in mind. Nightingale, a bit shy, remarked she wasn't Anna and couldn't explain things as well and warned him not to laugh. Roland promised sincerely he wouldn't. Popping a small dried fish into her mouth, Nightingale laid everything out. First, they had to accept that this wasn't something 1 or 2 generations could fix. The key was passing the knowledge down until the moment was right. Roland found her reasoning solid and was eager to hear more, but Nightingale shrugged, saying that all she wanted to say. She asserted that it was no longer their burden and reasons that human life was short, and just fulfilling their duty in this lifetime was enough. Whatever the future brought, whether later generations succeeded or not, wasn't up for them to decide. And so, even if Roland let himself worry so much that his hair turns gray, it still won't change a thing. Roland figured Nightingale's words counted as comfort, but either way, that kind of simple, straightforward thinking was just her style. Nightingale half expected him to laugh at her for being short-sighted, but Roland actually thought she saw things quite clearly. Feeling pleased, Nightingale remarked that if Roland worried future generations couldn't handle the burden, they could always share the responsibility with other races. She continued, asserting that they could build ruins and record the truth of the Divine War, just like the murals in the Cursed Temple had revealed the existence of the Radiation people and the Stickman people. This meant they, too, could construct sturdy underground fortresses across Grey Castle, carving the history into the walls as a warning to any civilizations that might join the fight. Nightingale declared that with enough time, at least one or two species would surely survive until the moment was right. Roland smiled, remarking with her own mind, it was impressive she thought this far, though Nightingale firmly asserted he didn't have to say the first half of that sentence. Suddenly, the office door burst open and Camilla rushed in, breathless. Roland blinked in surprise, then asked if she had just returned, praising her hard work and asking how the expedition had gone. But Camilla, clearly shaken, declared that something had happened at the Shadow Isles, then added that Joan had vanished. Roland's heart sank as he urged her to explain everything. Camilla recounted the events, adding that after the incident, they had waited days in the surrounding waters, but Joan never resurfaced. Thunder believed only Roland might have some idea of what Joan had encountered in the depths. Camilla admitted she couldn't believe what they saw underwater, and it all felt like something that shouldn't exist in reality. Roland, too, was stunned by how far things had escalated. He remarked that the deeper his understanding of this world grew, the more bizarre it all seemed. He'd once thought only the dream world was riddled with inconsistencies, but clearly, reality wasn't much better. The descriptions of stretched stone pillars and sea creatures being stretched out didn't seem like the result of brute force. The clearest sign was that just before Joan was pulled deeper inside, Camilla had seen her fingers stretched out. If it had been from sheer physical pulling, their psychic bond would have made Joan's pain unbearable, yet neither of them had felt any discomfort. The only explanation Roland could think of was spatial distortion. He firmly concluded that Thunder's judgment was right and that Joan was still alive. He speculated she had been thrown east of the sea line. When Camilla asked if crossing thousands of miles in an instant was even possible, Roland admitted it's more of a prediction, but one thing was certain, and the sea levels across the Shadow Isle had noticeably dropped. He reasoned that the change even affected the tides of the archipelago, and the amount of displaced water had to be immense. So, Roland picked up his quill and drew a circle on the paper. Roland recalled what Thunder had once mentioned, that the seawater near the shoreline did, in fact, flow westward. Thunder had emphasized that without replenishment, just 2 or 3 tides would be enough to drain the place dry. Roland drew a second circle on the paper and asked them if water was being moved from one location to another and poured out again, then the flow should be in waves. But that wasn't the case. The water was moving constantly, without pause, and to make that possible, it would need to pass through both circles instantaneously. So the question now is, what's the shortest path between those 2 points? Camilla immediately responded with a straight line. Roland remarked that this was theoretically correct, then folded the paper, overlapping the 2 circles. In doing so, he demonstrated how instant transport could occur. Camilla wasn't really buying it. Roland offered a bit more explanation, but before she could respond, her body swayed and collapsed to the side. Thankfully, Nightingale caught her just in time, noting she must have been completely exhausted. Roland asked her to bring Camilla back to the witch's building to rest, while he would send someone to notify Tilly. The scene then shifted to the demons. On a high platform, one of them watched the sun slowly dip beneath the horizon. Behind him, a subordinate stepped forward and reported that all preparations were now complete. Ursruk ordered him to keep watching. As he sank back into thought, the subordinate hesitated, questioning whether those insects would really act according to their plan. After all, the human should know his abilities well by now, and they have paid heavy prices just to set up the traps. What worried him was that Sky Lord would find out about this. Ursruk admitted the concern wasn't without reason, but declared it worth the risk. Gazing toward the distant rails, he remarked that this was the first time humans had managed to hold their own in a direct battle without relying on city walls, which was exactly why this emerging army had to be crushed while still being new. When asked about the recent fighting, the subordinate explained that it felt like they were fighting with their backs to the wall. Ursruk disagreed, asserting it was the enemy who had forced them into such a position. He explained they had built forward outposts to expand the supply range of their red mist supplies, but unlike 4 centuries ago, this no longer worked because humans could now strike from much longer distances. He adds that, coupled with the constant surveillance of witches, it was no surprise they were hitting walls at every turn. A flame rose in his palm as he concluded that without their towers, they could not overturn the situation, so he must destroy their eyes and sever their arms before they realized it. So much so, he was willing to bear all costs. The subordinate bowed deeply, vowing his loyalty. Ursruk felt himself close to a breakthrough and suspected this war might be the key. After all, brutal combat was the fastest path to growth. He comments that even someone as powerful as a lord wouldn't shy away from such a challenge. In his eyes, humans probably believed the same because only the final victor deserved to advance. Back in Neverwinter, Aletheia was explaining the bloodline routes, noting that every day, teams brought red mist to the demons stationed in the Takira ruins. 10 months ago, when Lorca first spotted the demons and ashes confirmed their position, it was 3 teams. She concluded that given the enemy's losses and reliance on a single supply line, any retreat by high-ranking demon would keep them close to this route. Wendy asked if the bloodline could be disguised. Alethea remarked that as long as demons needed the mist to survive, the route was the most reliable intel they had. While they had occasionally used massive mist transport to mask an offensive's direction, they had never reduced consumption to high troop movements because that would be suicide. Wendy seemed puzzled until Agatha explained that if the demons had a way to survive without the mist, they could bypass the front entirely. Then, they could just strike Grey Castle directly from both Misty Forest or even from Hermes. Alethea continued, describing the supply teams as mostly converted siege beasts with a few demon escorts, no threat to the Special Operations Unit or the Seagull. The real danger came from the flying beasts. When it's about the exact locations, she deferred to Edith, who explained this was the combined work of the general staff. Producing a report, she described the east side of the bloodline as flat and sparsely wooded, which was poor for hiding but ideal for the Seagull's view. Meanwhile, the west was far more complex, with uneven terrain and a small hill. Roland studied the report and the red markings, agreeing that the hill offered the best firing position. But its distance from the supply line meant any clash with high-ranking demons would stretch the Seagull's mid to long-range capabilities. What made it worse is that the hill's cover was minimal, making detection likely, and, most importantly, it was outside the range of their surveillance. Roland knew what Edith was thinking and figured that after all, the hill was the only high point overlooking the entire area. And while the demons seemed to be making their own preparations, when it came to a war involving magic, it was always better to be much more cautious. Edith notes just like how Roland set up tons of runes along the source of the Crimson Water River, which could act as an early warning system if anything happens. Edith explained that the Special Operations Unit's greatest advantage was secrecy. If their position was compromised, the planned sniper strike would be impossible. At that moment, Alethea's voice sounded in Roland's mind. She remarked that in the days of the Federation, the hardest thing to explain to mortals was magic. Most never even considered it in their planning, but Edith was different. She noted with some interest that Roland had quite a few interesting people under his command. Roland countered that it was because Alethea and the others had never truly taught them. He tells her that geniuses would always be rare, and no matter the era, education remained the most effective way to strengthen a civilization as a whole. He then asked Edith about her chosen location. She replied that it would be the forest at the mountain's base, although it had a narrower field of vision, but with excellent concealment, unobstructed firing arcs for aerial targets, and within range to coordinate with Princess Tilly. Other spots might be closer to the ruins, but that also meant risking running into fleeing demons. This, she argued, was the most balanced position. 2 squads, left and right, would cut off the demon's retreat if the enemy remained unaware. Andrea would strike from ambush, if not, the gods' punishment witches would intercept. With that being said, all of it depended on Anna's newly improved weaponry. Once the bombardment of Takira began, the First Army would send a force to extract the squads. Edith concluded that the timing would depend entirely on the demon's resistance. Then she glanced at Roland and asked for one more request, saying that once the final battle began, she wanted him to move to the third border town, along with the city hall officials and the witches in the castle. Berev, meanwhile, accuses her of trying to order the king. But Anna knew Edith feared a possible attack on Neverwinter. However, the odds were small but never impossible. The red mist revealed limits, but not the full measure of enemy strength. She gave an example, saying the same mist supply meant for 3,000 demons could instead allow 1,000 to travel much farther, which was a tactic used before. Her concern was that this time, it might be high-ranking demons making the move. The room went silent, and all eyes turned to Roland. He asked if this meant abandoning Takira. Edith clarified if defeat was inevitable, it wasn't abandonment, merely damage control. Roland nodded, agreed to her plan, and told Berev to make arrangements, and Berev complied. Standing, Roland addressed them all, saying he knew what they were thinking, and he knew that once this meeting ended, those with assignments would head to the front for the decisive battle over their right to survive. Victory was now within arm's reach. He points out that outside of this group, few understood the significance of this war, even fewer understood its true meaning, but one day, all humanity would remember. Even before the Divine War began, Grey Castle had gone on the offensive, holding the demons outside the fertile plains. Whether or not the enemy was hampered by the Sky-Sea realm, the weight of that victory would not diminish. Taking a deep breath, he admitted his only regret was that he could not march alongside them. The hall fell silent, but every gaze on him burned with confidence. At last, Roland declared, "Defeat the demons, take Takira, and I look forward to your triumph." The room then responded in unison, saying, "As you wish, your majesty." Days passed. The seagull drifted down from the sky and landed on the driveway. Tilly stepped out to find Ashes already waiting. She asked who's looking after Leaf's safety. Ashes reassured her, saying that whenever she's away, Leaf would vanish into the forest, where no one could touch her. In fact, it was usually Leaf herself who was the first to tell her when Tilly was arriving. They walked together, and it seemed like Tilly would stay until morning. Realizing they still have time, Ashes suggested a walk around the camp, then she could try out Leaf's experimental fruits, which she noted were surprisingly good, and later she could do some barbecue for her. But Tilly shook her head, saying there was too much to prepare for tonight. Ashes looked disappointed, so Tilly smiled and said it was Ashes who was gonna be busy. Over the next few days, they'd be together constantly, and Ashes needed to be ready. Ashes was confused, so Tilly explained that to intercept the demons, the special operations team would need her, and tonight, Tilly was going with her to the front. Leaf's role had already been arranged by Roland, and Tilly would explain it to her later. Ashes protested, asking why Tilly hadn't told her sooner. Tilly laughed, saying that although there might not be enough time for barbecue, having a few fruits was totally fine. Then she questioned whether Ashes was taking her or not. Of course, Ashes agreed right away. Hours later, back at their quarters, Tilly went over the plan. Ashes hated hearing that Tilly herself would be flying the Seagull. Roland had promised to keep her away from the front. Tilly corrected her, saying Roland hadn't agreed to anything. Ashes was surprised to hear this, even more surprised to hear it was Tilly herself who requested it in the first place. She then questioned Ash what she thinks Roland could do to stop her, like locking her up? That shut Ashes up, and Tilly smiled. If it truly were a suicide mission, perhaps Roland would have done so, but she was only a backup. She will only step in if Andrea fails to snipe the target, and further explained that her task was simply to deliver God's punishment witches to their position. Ashes still called it dangerous. Tilly knew she was going to say that. She noted Ashes must have pictured her flying alongside the demons, but Tilly explained that wasn't necessary. The enemy's movements depended on the red mist. They didn't need to be seen or use the Seagull as bait, and all they had to do was cut off the enemy's supply. She reasoned that the demon needs a resupply, and without it, he couldn't possibly to escape very far. By then the witches would be waiting, forcing him to fight on the spot. And the timing would give Tilly and Wendy plenty of room to retreat safely. Ashes still argued, but was cut off by Tilly, and she admitted no plan was risk-free, but she wasn't foolish enough to trap herself. The real reason she came forward was that she couldn't relax if she wasn't watching Ashes herself. Ashes almost said Your Majesty, but Tilly told her to use her name. Before she could, Tilly grabbed her by the collar, rose on her toes, and kissed her right on the lips. In the flickering candlelight, they slowly broke apart, both cheeks flushed. Tilly was the first to speak. Whether on Slumbering Isle or in Neverwinter, every time Ashes traveled, she'd been left waiting for days, sometimes months. It hadn't been like that when they first met in the old royal capital. Back then, they'd been together every day, and she wondered why be so careful now. Had there been no danger when they were hunted by the church? Either way, she didn't want to be left waiting anymore. Ashes exhaled slowly and said she understood. But she had one condition. Tilly guessed she was about to say don't take unnecessary risks, then added that Roland had already said the same. But Ashes shook her head, pulled her close, and said she wanted another kiss. The scene shifts, and Ferlin, alongside the staff department, salutes the three. Agatha saw the markings on the map, and Axe could tell they weren't slacking off. He then asked for a recap of recent events. The line on the map turned out to be enemy dugouts. Ferlin explained it was Sylvie who had been the first to notice when, 6 days ago, several demons emerged and began digging. Lightning later confirmed it, and that's why the sector was marked as dangerous. Hearing about this, the word trenches came to mind. He then went on to explain that Lightning's hand-drawn sketches showed a trench network that, while rough, mirrored the layout of the First Army's own forward lines. The main trenches ran parallel, 10 to several dozen meters apart, connected by multiple cross trenches. On the paper, a crude map outlined the enemy's work. Agatha remarked that they were clearly learning from humans, while Edith found it interesting that the cross trenches didn't look like escape routes to her, but rather a path to attack. Axe agreed, noting that staying low in a trench reduced the chance of being hit by shrapnel, but without weapons to match fortress artillery, a few ditches wouldn't change the outcome. Their only hope of victory was to break into the First Army's position, and keeping those trenches close together would cut the time needed to advance. When Agatha asked how they should respond, Edith said nothing needed to change. She remarked that once the digging reached artillery range, the Black River could open fire. It might be wasteful, but His Majesty had stocked enough ammunition for this battle, and she wanted to see if the enemy could really keep digging under shellfire. Axe then asked how the railway work was going. Ferlin reported there were more frequent enemy counterattacks, but the damage was minimal. Ordinary demons couldn't get close, thus, the demons stopped sending ground units altogether. Most of the pressure came from the flying beasts, usually in packs of a dozen or so. He suspected that Takira Ruins only had a few flying beasts left, adding that without cover from the high-ranking demon, they could have taken out even more. That made Agatha realize the Ursruk had been active again. Ferlin confirmed it, saying more than once, and each time, it deliberately drew fire from the anti-air squad, giving the flying beasts a chance to strike. Ferlin's tone grew heavier as he remarked that facing the high-ranking demon was like fighting a true monster. Edith wanted to hear what he had to say, so Ferlin explains that the enemy somehow always found the weakest point in their defenses and landed before anyone could react, leaving anyone who saw him frozen for several seconds, even wearing a god's punishment stone. He also noted that without that protection, it was worse. Workers who peeked from cover out of curiosity were hit with crushing fear. The closer you were, the stronger the effect, and the flying beasts circling in the clouds used those moments to strike them. Even with Sylvie's warnings, hitting him was almost impossible. Their best result so far was shooting down one of his arms, but the next time he reappeared, they noticed his arm had regenerated. If it were just a special healing ability like Lady Manhwa, that would be one thing, but he paused, then admitted that soldiers reported the demon's movements growing harder to track, as if he'd adapted to their attacks. Before, a single machine gun could pin him down, now it took multiple squads working together. Without enough ammunition in God's punishment stones, Ferlin believed just Ursruk himself could wipe them all out. Agatha admitted that back in the Federation era, this was a common sight. As long as a demon survived, it always returned stronger. She reveals that high-ranking demons evolved through constant battle. The deeper the wounds, the greater the growth in both magic and skill when they came back. She closed her eyes and acknowledged that many extraordinary witches had fallen to them, failing to pass their own limits while their killers advanced instead. Still, not every demon could survive a crippling injury. To recover this fast, it had to be part of its own ability. A bead of sweat slid down Axe's forehead as he wondered about the possibility of this high-ranking demon having both a curse and regeneration ability. Agatha agreed it was likely. She backed Ferlin's assessment, calling the enemy a true monster, which means they must take him down here and now because if he slipped away, the next encounter could be catastrophic. A train rumbled past, breaking the tension for a moment. They watched it roll toward the front, loaded with supplies, with all sorts of weapons mounted on top, with heavy machine guns, large-caliber weapons, and of course massive artillery. The group drifted toward the watchtower, eyes settling on the ruins in the distance. Edith asked if this was where Agatha had been born. Her mind pulled her back in time, standing in the center. A witch congratulated her for joining the Federation, another praised her as the youngest high-ranking witch in history, welcoming her on behalf of the Explorers Society. Younger witches crowded around, calling her incredible. Back then, she was filled with pride. Years later, inside a hidden lab where several witches lay gravely wounded. One demanded if she knew what she was doing, pointing out that these women had given everything for the Federation and were only unconscious. She raged that Agatha was turning them into test subjects. Agatha countered coldly, saying head trauma left almost no chance of recovery, and she should be fully aware of this. Rather than die in a haze, they would want to contribute to something greater. The woman still refused to accept it, but Agatha no longer looked at her. The decision, she stated, had been signed by Lady Akalis herself. If she couldn't accept it, she could walk away. The memory jumped again. This time, the demons were breaking through the city walls. Her attendant warned the coalition couldn't hold much longer and urged her to flee, but Agatha's younger sister hadn't returned. He dragged her back, insisting her sister was a garrison soldier and would never abandon the line. If Agatha died here, it would betray her sister's resolve. She hesitated, but the demons were closing in fast. Freezing a few in their tracks, she told her attendants to run while they had the chance. They asked where they could even go if they left Takira, and she pointed toward the forest declared over the mountains, across the rivers, into the wilds, where they could rebuild from the ground up. The next memory was when Agatha cradled her attendant as he lay dying in her arms, asking why he had pushed himself to the very end. If he had just run, he might still be alive. But he told her that even without magic, he still understands a lot of things, but protecting her had always been his duty. Pulled back to the present, Agatha turned to Axe with a request asking if the First Army could push the front line within 10 kilometers of Takira. She requested the first volley of artillery aimed at the city to be fired by her and the Takira witches. As night fell, and the ground itself seemed to shudder, demons erupted from below, flooding into the trenches. Two massive shadows followed, and Sylvie realized they were enormous stones of God's punishment, rendering her ability useless. She snatched up the phone, and moments later, alarms screamed through the camp. The engineering crews were ordered to drop their tools and head for the nearest shelter. Under the First Army's direction, the workers filed underground, one by one, until the heavy blast doors sealed behind them. Silence then took the night. Sylvie reported the evacuation complete, blackout in place, and the First Army moving into position. Then another phone rang. This time, Vayner was asking for enemy coordinates and test fire position. Almost at the same time, both Black River 1 and 2 made the same request. Sylvie patched through to Lightning and Maisie, asking where they were. Lightning replied that she had just taken off, with Maisie right above her, and asked if the demon had launched a full-scale attack. Sylvie believed it was and suspected the enemy was using the giant stone of God's punishment to block her sight. Lightning said she knew what to do and was ready to head over to the Takira ruins. Because it was too dark to see, she told Maisie to switch to night vision. In midair, Maisie shifted her pigeon form into an owl, and the two pressed on until Sylvie urged them to come back, saying the high-ranking demon is on the move. A chill ran down Lightning's spine, then she forced the fear down, thinking he wouldn't spot her so easily. If she turned back now, she'd never learn what the demons were hiding. She told Sylvie not to worry, as long as she stayed out of his anti-magic zone, he wouldn't catch her, then told Maisie to keep eyes on him while tucking her into her shirt, then she accelerated. Sylvie's warning came sharper this time, saying the enemy had noticed her. Maisie spotted him ahead to their right. Lightning saw the flash of red just before a beam of energy lanced toward them. She banked hard and dove, but he came after her, claws slicing through the air. She twisted again, shaking him off, and in that break spotted several spider demons hauling huge cylindrical stones towards Neverwinter. Just then, Lightning shot upward to get a better look, then suddenly stopped. Maisie asked her why. Lightning had noticed the demon wasn't following her anymore. Clearly, the demon knew he could never catch up, and this time, she declared victory. Just then, she raised a middle finger toward the distant shadow and noted this was the gesture of winning that His Majesty had once taught her. Afterwards she sped off toward Neverwinter. Just then, shells streaked skyward like falling stars. Maisie murmured that it was beautiful. Meanwhile, Lightning clenched her fists. In the command center, the roof trembled with each blast. Axe slammed a hand on the table, remarking that if this had been a daytime assault, those monsters wouldn't have lasted half as long. Edith stayed calm, pointing out that's exactly why the enemy had chosen a night assault. Still, the results were good. Without Sylvie, they wouldn't even know where to aim, let alone track the blind spots. For now, the demons were still taking the beating, and there was no reason to rush. Axe hated wasting hard-earned ammunition, but Edith wasn't worried because no one could push that thing forever. She figured the demons knew it too. The moment they came within mortar range, they'd have no choice but to throw everything they had into one big push. She smirked, almost amused, while remarking that the demons thought the night was their advantage, but they had no idea the flares would turn darkness into daylight, and when that happened, there'd be no more hiding. Far off, Ursruk made his move as the bombardment had finally stopped, and then he ordered everyone to charge. However, Greycastle's gunners were in position. The signal went up, and flares arced high into the air, bursting overhead and drifting slowly down. Demons blinked up at the sudden glare, and in that hesitation, Greycastle locked in their aim. A storm of shells roared overhead, slamming into the ground behind the massive pillars. The earth heaved, the air shook, and before the dust could settle, another wave of flares lit the field again. From the rear, Ursruk stared towards the sky, and he commented that half a year ago, these same humans had been helpless at night, forced to cower in their camps. Now they'd not only found an answer but waited patiently for the perfect moment to use it. He realizes they can't be thinking of humans as insects anymore. With such calculation, this is no longer the work of prey, but rather an enemy worth taking seriously, and he thinks their lord needed to hear about this. The battle continued and the bombardment shredded the demon lines. Meanwhile, Ursruk broke into a sprint, determined to take out the enemy's eyes and arms before they became a real problem. So, he vaulted up to a hot air balloon, then broke into a sinister grin, seeing the person's terrifying face, then tore them in two, letting the bodies fall from the sky. His piercing cry rolled over the battlefield. It spurred the demons forward in a full, frenzied rush. A shell ripped through one of the demons, machine gun fire carved into another, but they kept coming, scrambling over their own dead. Meanwhile, barrels smoked from non-stop firing. Spider demons hurled themselves at the lines, but even they couldn't withstand the storm of bullets. It didn't take long for the plane to become a meat grinder. Flying beasts swooped in, but Greycastle's anti-air crews were already tracking them, knocking them out of the sky in bursts of fire and shrapnel. Again and again, meanwhile, Ursruk himself was struggling and hurled himself into the defenses, trying to break the wall of gunfire. Each time, the sheer density of bullets forced him back, red-eyed and furious, as more of his people collapsed. By the time the sun started rising again, the guns were almost too hot to touch, and countless casings crunched underfoot. The shooting finally tapered off, leaving only the acrid haze of gunpowder and the stench of blood. Agatha stepped out from the underground command post with Axe and the others, walking toward the front. Beyond the lines lay craters, mangled corpses, and the last of the enemy limping into the distance. Witnessing all this, her breath quickened, and then, with a rush of exhilaration, she announced they had achieved victory. A soldier pulled back a heavy canvas sheet, revealing a row of fortress cannons lined up in perfect formation. He then handed over the rope to Agatha's hand. Phyllis stepped up beside her. She admitted she owed Agatha an apology, saying that 4 centuries ago, she'd mocked her behind her back for relying on mortals, insisting that giving such important tasks to them would only end in disaster. Agatha smiled, admitting that was what everyone said back then. Then she asked what she thought now. Phyllis took a rope from her hand and, with a grin, said that fighting shoulder to shoulder with mortals wasn't so bad after all. The soldier raised a flag, then announced fire. The Takira witches pulled their firing ropes together, and the cannons roared as one. Shells screamed through the air before slamming into the Takira ruins, blasting apart not only crumbling stone but the few demons still lurking there. Meanwhile, Sylvie was watching the artillery and then announced it's time to begin.